Shannon, would you be willing to say a few more words? I think we read this assignment for this week because you lighted on Bukowski. Can you tell us why you thought he'd make for a good discussion and why we should explore his poems? I could have said to you, what in your view is the appeal? Suppose we're poet novices. What would you say to a group if you were introducing his poetry? What would you tell people to watch for? Can you talk some about that?
Yes. So one thing that's definitely real, that has, I think, no argument, is that he didn't want to be considered a mainstream poet. He didn't want to be grouped in with the beat poets that were really popular at the time, because he was from Hollywood. He was from Hollywood, which was a grittier part of the state and not as glitzy. He kind of speaks to the underdog. People who are Bukowski fans tend to be folks that are a little bit rebellious and kind of an underdog, sometimes just kind of rough. They tend to be kind of rough people themselves. And so the way he was in real life, defending himself as he didn't want to be mainstream. He didn't want to be the famous poet. He was still continually grouped in with these folks, especially in panels or when they had a group reading. He'd be up there with folks, and it was because he sold so much. He never won any major awards. He did win a grant in 1974 from the National Endowment for the Arts, and he did receive a press award. And his life, which was kind of a really tragic life, was people always wanted to try to capture it on film. So he does. People relate to him on almost a primal level. But he comes across as and it's in the style of his writing as well. It's extremely conversational. He is able to find some sort of a poetic observation and a point hidden in his poems. And it's almost always a social commentary. It's about the average Joe, the person who's like struggling with their own inner demons, and then also is extremely observant about what is happening around them. So the appeal for his work, I believe, is that somehow he's tapped into the language of the average person who is feeling a bit beat up by the world, and yet somehow is thriving.
Thank you. You really captured a lot in what you said. Thank you.
And it's difficult to know where to put him. His category, I was calling him embellished autobiographical observations is what the mishmash title I gave him. But Wikipedia describes him as dirty realism, transgressive fiction, a part of a transgressive fiction movement. And I thought that was kind of interesting.
You know, I think about the Whitman poems that we looked at and then that we've read. And there are sections that I think have to be not imagined experience, but based on actual observation of life. But his account is so deliberately lyrical, almost musical, and Bukowski's is not. It's kind of deliberately fragmented. in each of the poems that I've read. And as I've tried to read him over the years, I've always set him down and thought, well, that's enough Bukowski for this evening. And not someone, if after a hard day, after a hard day, I'll go and pick up Yeats. And I don't know that I want to say find solace in reading him, but certainly restorative. And that doesn't happen to me when I read Bukowski's poems.
Somehow I feel like I should congratulate you on having a good life. I think that's a sign of a good life, is if you don't agree or even understand the concept of Bukowski. And something right in your life.
Every poem reminds me of where I grew up in South Buffalo. I mean, he captures the world that I'm very familiar with.
I was appreciative, Shannon, of the poems that you selected for us to read, because I am feeling much more open to him reading what you selected. I also think, though, that we're not looking at what I think of as kind of vintage Bukowski. I can remember discovering him, it would have been in the 1980s, and buying a used copy of one of his books and then feeling kind of sullied that I owned it. It was so raw and so profane, and I'm like that. When it would be interesting to me to read those exact same poems today and see if I still feel that they are. But I didn't feel that he was telling me a story about this terrible abuse of himself as a 6-year-old and so on. I thought he was just in your face. In your face.
Yeah. Well, he definitely was in people's faces, that's for sure.
I remember when my youngest son, who reads widely, was going through his Angry Young Man stage, I guess I'd say, was just so smitten with Bukowski. So I thought, well, I better read a little bit. And I just, like Amory, I guess, I haven't told her this, but it was just too raw for me. But this time around, maybe it's because of the poems that you selected, I liked reading him. I also went to Google and put in Bukowski quotes, and there are all these pithy remarks that are extractions from his poems, and I thought, I really like reading those because then there's less to get through. Because I think he's very he's very good at putting forth things in a way, well, like this. Some people never go crazy. What truly horrible lives they must leave. I don't hate people. I just feel better when they aren't around. He always gets to some point of distillation in his poetry that I like and respond to. But I can't read all the raw stuff. It's just too much. So thanks for the sanitized poems.
The thing that I remember too is reading all the raw stuff and then looking at pictures of him, and his face is just a roadmap of rough living.
Terrible background. Yeah.
That video was really good. I watched the video, so that when they talked about him being a young man being picked on for his accent, his dad beating him for no reason, having really bad acne, which made him even further, distancing himself from any connection, working for the post office. I thought this story was, a tragic story, and then he's discovered in his mid-50s, he has that whole body of work that he's already developed. Probably some of the stuff that you guys are talking about. I like this style a little. I mean, I thought it was, like you pointed out, Shannon, I felt like he was like a pugilist, for a poet. He's like just throwing these terms around, and it's a little bit more blue collar kind of relationship with the reader?
It was like, it was almost a spiritual thing for me when I discovered him. And as you know, I pocketed my friend's book.
You're the reason I don't loan my books out.
That's the only time I've done it, I'm telling you.
Sure.
But at the time that this book fell into my life, I was working for a temp agency that continued to send me to factories. I was making $11 an hour, and I had a very simple lifestyle. I had a very simple life, and I worked extremely hard. I didn't have a car, so everything I did, I had to walk to and take the bus to, and I was having a lot of pity parties for myself and not feeling so great about my prospects. And so this is 5 years ago. So I was, whatever that is, 47, 46 years old, and just super disappointed in my world. And just absolutely thankful that there was a voice that somehow I could identify with it. I'm not a womanizer. I'm not an alcoholic, and I don't get blacked out drunk. So, and I wasn't horribly abused as a child. So I'm like, there's so many things I do not identify with for his personal life, but somehow the poetry itself and his observation and this almost like a ribbon of pain that can be felt through his poems, that was a frequency that I could attach myself to. And I don't know how or why, but it gave, perhaps it gave a label, perhaps it helped me to identify and give a label to some of the emotions that I was feeling. But that's my personal experience with his work.
When I was reading for today and reading the one probably about just I've come to this same job for night after night, that piece that we read, I immediately thought of the poem you had written about being the cleanup person, the sweep up the cigarette butts at the casino. It was that same kind of, I just immediately link those two pieces together.
Well, his poem, The 12-Hour Night, helped me to articulate my experience as the overnight detox person at a casino. That was such a bizarre world for me. And it put the flag on my planet. It said, this is what you're experiencing. And not only that, people have been experiencing this for centuries. This idea that you just beat the heck out of your soul so that you got rent money. And it's hard, it really is hard. And so if the School of Hard Knocks creates character, right? He's got a lot of character. Nobody could argue that Bukowski did not have character. He definitely has a lot of that.
So here comes politics. Here comes, we can't talk about these things. We discovered the value of how, when we started thinking about who are our essential workers, and we thought about the medical people, certainly, but all of a sudden we realized that the guys in the trash trucks are really essential to keeping our areas livable, and the people stocking the shelves so that as soon as new toilet paper comes, it's on the shelf. We realized that we can't exist without a whole workforce that we don't usually pay nearly enough attention to. Even with the medical, when they were talking about the risk that the doctors and nurses, and I kept thinking, but what about the people that are carrying out sacks of soil contaminated and cleaning up and.
Right. And they're not being paid a living wage. So most of these folks live paycheck to paycheck. And for them to have maybe one paycheck missing, or maybe not have any income for 1 to 3 months, it's devastating to so many people. The inflation and the cost of living, I wish, was more upfront in the political discussion. I don't understand why people can't earn an honest living, or that the cost of living couldn't be adjusted somehow. I don't understand how all of these things work, but I know what you can recognize it when something's wrong or not working, right?
I wish I don't have the numbers in my head, but reading a thing one day about some people getting so incensed at $15 an hour. And that doesn't add up for working full time to a livable wage. The numbers were just telling. Maybe those of us who remember when the hourly rate was $1.75 or $2.25 or so on, think this is just, people are just rolling in dough with a $1,500. No, doesn't put you over the poverty level.
I know.
My father drove a truck and my mother worked in a box factory. And they worked hard, long hours, and, jobs that took a toll on them. And over the years, I've been so weary of people claiming that the corporate execs who vote themselves millions of dollars earned it. If you say to, there are so many people in our country who are prepared to provide that answer. Well, don't you think they earned it? Hell no, they didn't earn it. They voted it to themselves. I can't even participate in the discussion.
Mm.
So what did you think about the ending of the poem, The 12-Hour Night? And my life was touched by magic, and it still is.
The attachment that's called Part 2. Would someone like to read that poem?
I can read it.
Go ahead, Linda, if you're going to do that.
The 12-Hour Night. I found myself in middle age working a 12-hour night, night after night, year after year, and somehow there seemed to be no way out. I was drained, empty, and so were my coworkers. We huddled together under the whip, under intolerable conditions, and many of us were fearful of being fired, for there was nothing left for us. Our bodies were worn, our spirits whipped. There was a sense of unreality. One becomes so tired, one becomes so dazed that there is confusion and anguish mixed in with the deadliness. I think that, too, kept some of us working there. 12-hour nights. I can't explain why I remained. Cowardice, probably. Then one night I stood up and said, I'm finished. I'm leaving this job now. What? Asked my comrades. Do you know what the hell you're doing? Where will you go? Come back. You're crazy. What will you do? I walked down the rows of them, all those faces. I walked down the aisle past rows and rows of them, all the faces looking. He's crazy. Then I was in the elevator writing down, first floor and out. I walked into the street. I walked along the street. Then I turned and looked at the towering building 4 stories high. I saw the lights in the windows. I felt the presence of those 3,000 people in there. Then I turned and walked away into the night, and my life was touched by magic, and it still is.
It's more than money. It is the money, of course, but it's more than money. It's the class system in this country, the lack of respect for people who are doing that kind of work. The lack of respect for yourself when you're doing that kind of work that he talks about. You lose yourself. That in the poem that you sent on his visiting that cafe, I can't remember its title, but where he sees the waitress cook as authentic. And then he has to go back out into the inauthentic world. To me, that it's just startling. It's so true. And that doesn't have to do with money. It has to do with political hierarchy.
Those two poems side by side are fascinating to think about.
They both have
When he has such peace and love in that place, watching the cook who's having a good time, and
It's the poem called Nirvana.
food. That's the best of the results of your labor, directly making a product you're handing to someone and its sustenance. That's glorious, as opposed to just the tedium that he describes. Now I'm thinking back to Ron saying, people would say that the man who owned the box factory had earned it. No, it was the night shift people working with dangerous cutters and such that made the boxes that made him the fortune.
Mm-hmm.
Anyhow, I'm really liking thinking about the difference between the different experiences of those two. Because I don't remember if that poem talked about the dishwasher, but I bet the dishwasher was having fun getting clean plates out there.
It's a great time. Having a great time.
Yeah.
There are things that I really like about this poem. I like the story that it tells, and it's compelling. And there are things that he captures, the co-workers and how they exist and kind of huddled together, he says, and there's all that mutual support, and then whatever, he doesn't characterize what it takes to walk away from it, but we have to supply that. But it's a real story for me, and even the dialogue is kind of real. The thing that I see in it that it's hard for me to reckon with is the level of self-indulgence. And I don't know if it's even a fair claim. I walked down the rows of them, all those faces. I walked down the aisle past rows and rows of them. All the faces looking, he's crazy. And I don't know how else he can separate himself. He doesn't really explain himself to them. He just says he's going. So on the one hand, I kind of like the restraint with which he leaves, and he doesn't condemn them. He doesn't blame them or call them names or anything. He just leaves, just extracts himself. So there are a lot, for all that it tells us why. Well, he says, I can't explain why I remained. And then all of a sudden he's gone, and he doesn't really explain why he leaves except to describe the conditions there. So there's a level of restraint in the poem that I really like, that is withholding explanations. It feels, especially in certain sections, I'll use the phrase again, self-indulgent. And the ending is actually a real surprise.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to talk about, Betty's question about the ending. It doesn't fit for me, but what do you think, Ron?
It's a surprise, and it's a payoff. It's a confirmation. But we take the claim, we're forced to take the claim at face value. My life was touched by magic, and it still is. I don't know that it's convincing.
I'm not convinced at all. And the little I know about his life, I don't think he led a magical life.
Yeah.
Well, I think it was an epiphany, if I can say that. I mean, here he is. He's in this factory. He's kind of working 12 hours a day. Everybody's kind of brainwashed into working 12 hours a day. They're doing it to make ends meet. They don't see a way out of doing this. And And I think he reflects and he says, why are we doing this? Why don't we stand up for ourselves? Why don't I stand up for myself at least? Recognize that this is taking a toll on me. My life is worth more than working here 12 hours a day. I need to find something else better to do with it. So now I'm going to go out. I'm just going to quit. I think you were saying I don't need to pass judgment on why other people are staying because they have their own reasons. But my reason, I need to do something else in my life. And I think that is magical in the way that he recognizes that, has that moment, and thinks that even if his life is tough and everything, but he realizes that he has options, he has some control over it. So this is what he's going to do in the moment. And hopefully he'll discover something afterwards. But that's kind of the fairy tale ending that I put on it.
Mm.
And I fixed my microphone.
What it reminds me of is deciding to get a divorce. Once you're in such pain and you cannot stand what is going on, and eventually you decide to do something about it. And there is a magic that is so enlivening about doing that by just saying, "See you around."
Yeah.
Out the door.
I would have liked it if he had concluded the poem with, "And my life was touched by magic." It seems glib and a little cheap to end with, "and it still is."
Mm.
Because
My version of what Lynn said is that the magic is that it is his life. And it's not that it's turned into something grand, it's just his life, and I think Mike was saying essentially the same thing. But that's me providing that construct.
I think he became aware that he had more control over his life than he first supposed at the beginning of the poem. And whether he was able to keep away from falling into the same trap again of the same circumstances is hard to say. But I think even if he did, he would have that self-awareness to say, I have this control over my life. I can look for other options. I think that's a very, another trite word is empowering, when you realize that you have more control than what you lead, because you can talk yourself out of all the control that you do have, especially when you're being oppressed. And so, and I think this poem has some, talks a little bit about oppression. So I think realizing that he has some control in it is the magic, and it still is. I'm going to go.
You know what this poem reminds me of? The dialogue between Jules and Vincent in Pulp Fiction. When Jules says he's going to get out of the life and Vincent says you'll be a bum. What are you going to do? You'll be a bum. And Jules says, I'm just going to walk the earth like what the guy in the David Carradine character. And there's no way that he can convince Vincent. These two hitmen, and one of them claims the other one's going to be a bum if he gives up the life. Anyway, I'm not going to carry that any further. And the question for me that I always ask in reading a poem that comes to this kind of conclusion is it earned in the poem? And he gives us all this life that, in contrast, before the life that he chooses at the end. To some degree, it works for me. I poetically, I'm not sure that the short turn at the end carries sufficient weight. Maybe that's it to balance all that's gone before.